She called me her foundation, while planning her escape to someone more exciting. Those words should have made me feel valued and essential, but they turned out to be the gentle way of saying I was the safe backup plan while she explored more thrilling options with someone who represented everything I apparently wasn't. I met Celeste at a neighborhood block party in suburban Phoenix 2.5 years ago, one of those perfect desert evenings in early October where the whole street comes alive with barbecue smoke and kids running between sprinklers as temperatures finally drop below triple digits after months of brutal summer heat. The entire block had gathered for our annual potluck celebration, complete with string lights draped between palm trees and folding tables groaning under homemade enchiladas and store-bought desserts. I was naturally the guy making sure elderly Mrs. Martinez had a comfortable chair positioned perfectly in the shade and that the new family from Michigan understood which taco truck had the best carnitas and how to navigate Phoenix's confusing freeway system, while Celeste commanded attention effortlessly from the center of every conversation circle like some sort of irresistible social gravitational force. She had this magnetic quality that drew people in like moths to a flame, the kind of woman who could make discussing grocery lists sound like fascinating poetry and turn mundane small talk about Phoenix traffic patterns into captivating storytelling that left everyone hanging on her every word. Her laugh was infectious and completely genuine, not the practiced social performance I'd grown accustomed to from other women at these neighborhood gatherings who seemed more focused on being seen than actually connecting. I was immediately captivated by her natural energy and enthusiasm but also deeply intrigued by the vulnerability I glimpsed during unguarded moments when she thought nobody was watching, those brief pauses between conversations when her radiant smile would fade slightly and something wounded and cautious would flicker across her expressive features. Within weeks of casual coffee dates at the local cafe and long evening walks around the neighborhood discussing everything from desert landscaping challenges to childhood dreams we'd never shared with anyone else, I learned the full devastating story about her recent breakup with Marcus, her manipulative ex-boyfriend who'd systematically controlled her finances and methodically isolated her from friends and family for nearly 3 years before she finally found the courage to leave that toxic relationship behind. She was still emotionally raw from that traumatic experience, questioning everything about love and trust and wondering aloud if her judgment about people was permanently damaged after falling for Marcus's initial charm that had gradually transformed into psychological warfare designed to keep her dependent and compliant. I naturally became her emotional anchor during those fragile months of rebuilding her sense of self-worth and learning to trust her own instincts again after years of being told she was oversensitive and dramatic whenever she questioned Marcus's increasingly controlling behavior. I helped her relocate from that cramped studio apartment near downtown where Marcus had monitored her every move through security cameras he'd installed for her safety to a bright one-bedroom place across town in a quiet complex with actual windows that opened and breathing room to think clearly without his oppressive presence. The move required 3 separate trips in my pickup truck because she owned almost nothing after Marcus had convinced her that material possessions were chains that limited personal growth, his twisted philosophy that conveniently kept her dependent on his approval for everything from furniture purchases to friendship choices. When freelance graphic design work dried up during slow seasons, which happened more frequently than she'd initially admitted while trying to maintain her independence, I quietly covered her utilities and groceries without making it feel like charity or creating obligation, simply telling her we were a team working toward the same goals and that healthy partnerships meant supporting each other through temporary rough patches. I genuinely believed we were building something permanent and meaningful as she slowly healed from her trauma and began trusting again, watching her confidence return in small increments like desert flowers blooming after rare rainfall in the Sonoran landscape. Those early months felt absolutely magical as Celeste discovered simple pleasures Marcus had systematically forbidden, like choosing her own meals at restaurants without his commentary about calories or staying out past 10 without explaining her whereabouts to anyone or wearing clothes he hadn't pre-approved as appropriate. She would curl up against me during Arizona's dramatic summer thunderstorms and whisper that I was her foundation, the steady ground beneath her feet after years of emotional earthquakes with Marcus who'd made her question her own reality through constant gaslighting and manipulation. I took enormous pride in being that stability and safety for her, improving through consistent actions that not all men were controlling manipulators who used love as a weapon to systematically diminish their partner's sense of worth and independence. She seemed so genuinely grateful for basic human decency and respect that I felt like I was winning the relationship lottery simply by treating her like an equal human being deserving of kindness rather than someone who needed to earn affection through compliance and submission. But looking back now with painful clarity and the wisdom that comes from betrayal, I can see the subtle warning signs I ignored because I was so focused on being her healing sanctuary rather than paying attention to what she actually wanted for her long-term future. She started making increasingly frequent offhand comments about how predictable our weekend routines had become, how other couples on her Instagram seemed to live more adventurously with spontaneous road trips and extreme sports, how maybe traditional relationship boundaries were just outdated social conditioning we'd accepted without questioning whether they actually served modern people who valued personal freedom. I brushed off these observations as natural growth pains and healthy curiosity, convinced that her newfound confidence and willingness to question conventional wisdom meant our relationship was strengthening and evolving rather than recognizing that she was systematically preparing to outgrow what I represented in her healing journey. The foundation I thought I was building for both of us to share turned out to be merely the launching pad for her escape to more exciting possibilities with someone who embodied the adventure and unpredictability she craved, but at the time, I was just genuinely happy to see her radiant smile returning after the emotional darkness Marcus had left behind. The warning signs that should have alarmed me instead became the background soundtrack to what I convinced myself was our relationship naturally evolving and maturing beyond the initial healing phase. Celeste started attending what she called creative networking events at trendy downtown Phoenix venues, gatherings that supposedly connected freelance designers with potential clients and collaborators but somehow always extended well past midnight despite starting at 7 in the evening. I initially supported these networking opportunities because I wanted her career to flourish and understood that building professional relationships often required socializing outside normal business hours, especially in the creative industries where personal connections drive most opportunities. But the explanations for these increasingly frequent late nights became progressively more elaborate and defensive, involving detailed stories about last-minute client meetings that couldn't be rescheduled and creative brainstorming sessions that naturally flowed into impromptu group dinners at expensive restaurants I'd never heard of before. She would return home around 2 or 3 in the morning with carefully rehearsed explanations about networking gold mines and potential collaborations that were absolutely worth the time investment. But her enthusiasm felt forced and her eye contact became evasive whenever I asked basic follow-up questions about the people she'd met or the projects they'd discussed. The defensive edge in her voice when describing these events should have been my first major clue that something fundamental was shifting in our relationship dynamic, but I was so determined to be the supportive boyfriend who trusted his girlfriend's professional judgment that I ignored my instincts and rationalized away the growing unease settling in my chest. Around this same time, she began increasingly criticizing my predictable nature and steady approach to life, making pointed comments about how I preferred planning our weekend activities in advance rather than embracing spontaneous adventures that might lead to exciting discoveries. She started comparing me unfavorably to Preston, her charismatic new colleague at the design studio who seemed to embody everything she found lacking in our relationship structure and my personality. Preston was apparently this dynamic force of nature who posted extreme sports videos on social media showing him rock climbing in Sedona and mountain biking through treacherous desert trails, while also talking constantly about his cryptocurrency investments and his philosophy that life should be lived without safety nets or conventional limitations. According to Celeste's increasingly frequent mentions of his adventures and insights, Preston represented authentic living while I represented the safe, boring choice that kept her trapped in conventional relationship expectations. She began bringing up his name in casual conversation multiple times per week, sharing his opinions about everything from investment strategies to relationship structures with the kind of admiration that made my stomach tighten with recognition of what I was witnessing. Preston apparently believed that traditional monogamy was an outdated social construct designed to control people's natural desires, that real love meant giving your partner complete freedom to explore connections with others, and that jealousy was just evidence of insecurity and possessiveness rather than legitimate concern for relationship boundaries. These philosophical discussions about modern relationship structures became more frequent and pointed as Celeste tested my reactions to increasingly radical concepts about personal freedom and authentic self-expression. I should have recognized these conversations as her systematically preparing me for what was coming next, but instead I engaged with her ideas intellectually, thinking we were having healthy discussions about relationship evolution rather than realizing she was essentially asking for permission to cheat. My natural inclination was to suppress the growing jealousy and unease gnawing at my confidence because I genuinely didn't want to be the controlling boyfriend who monitored his girlfriend's friendships or questioned her professional networking activities. I convinced myself that mature relationships required trust and space, that my discomfort with Preston's influence was probably just insecurity about my own less exciting life compared to his adventure-filled social media presence. But the emotional distance between us was becoming impossible to ignore as Celeste grew increasingly distracted and disconnected during our time together, constantly checking her phone and responding to messages with secretive smiles that she claimed were just funny memes from her design group chat. Our intimate moments became less frequent and more mechanical, like she was going through the motions of being my girlfriend while her mind was clearly elsewhere, probably fantasizing about the kind of excitement Preston represented. She began making cutting remarks about commitment being restrictive and outdated thinking, suggesting that people who truly loved each other should encourage exploration and growth rather than trying to lock each other down with possessive expectations about exclusivity and traditional relationship structures that served patriarchal control systems. The most painful part was watching her transform from the grateful, vulnerable woman who'd called me her foundation into someone who seemed embarrassed by our stable, predictable relationship and hungry for the kind of drama and uncertainty she'd supposedly escaped when she left Marcus. I started noticing how she would light up when discussing Preston's latest adventures or sharing his insights about living authentically, displaying the kind of animated enthusiasm that had originally drawn me to her but was now directed towards someone else's philosophy and lifestyle. She criticized my architectural work as too conventional and safe, suggesting that truly creative people like Preston understood that art required risk and pushing boundaries rather than following established protocols and building codes. These attacks on my career felt particularly brutal because I'd always been proud of my work designing sustainable buildings that would serve communities for decades, but suddenly my focus on structural integrity and long-term functionality was evidence of my limited imagination and fear of genuine innovation. The comparison game became relentless as she contrasted my weekend preferences for hiking familiar trails and cooking dinner at home with Preston's spontaneous road trips to explore hidden desert locations and his willingness to try extreme activities that could result in serious injury or death. She made it clear that she found my concern for safety and planning ahead to be suffocating rather than caring, evidence that I was holding her back from discovering her true adventurous nature that had been suppressed during her relationship with Marcus and was now being reawakened by Preston's influence. I began dreading conversations about our future together because she'd grown distant and non-committal about previous plans we'd made, like the camping trip to Zion National Park we'd booked months in advance or the pottery class we'd signed up for together. These commitments suddenly felt like burdens to her rather than shared experiences to anticipate, and she started suggesting we keep our options open instead of being locked into rigid schedules that prevented spontaneous opportunities from arising. The humiliation I experienced at Tyler's housewarming party in Scottsdale became the defining moment when I finally understood that I'd been living in complete denial about what my relationship with Celeste had actually become. Tyler had invited roughly 30 people to celebrate his new place, a sleek modern house with floor-to-ceiling windows and a pool that reflected the desert sunset like liquid gold, exactly the kind of sophisticated gathering where Celeste typically thrived as the magnetic center of attention. Despite being cold and emotionally distant toward me all week, barely speaking during our drives to work and responding to my attempts at conversation with distracted one-word answers, she insisted we attend together, claiming it would be good for us to socialize as a couple and reconnect with friends we'd been neglecting during our recent rough patch. I should have recognized this insistence as suspicious given her recent pattern of avoiding couple activities, but I was desperately hoping the party might restore some normalcy to our increasingly strained relationship dynamic. The moment we walked through Tyler's front door, I watched Celeste transform from the withdrawn, irritated woman who'd barely acknowledged my existence all week into the vivacious, charismatic person I'd fallen in love with 2 years earlier, except none of that renewed energy was directed toward me. She immediately began scanning the room with obvious purpose, her eyes lighting up when she spotted Preston standing near the outdoor bar area, looking exactly like the adventure-seeking rebel she'd described in countless conversations, with his sun-bleached hair and expensive casual clothes that somehow managed to look effortlessly thrown together despite probably costing more than my monthly rent. I busied myself fetching drinks and making small talk with Tyler's coworkers and neighbors, trying to be the sociable guest while keeping one eye on Celeste's increasingly obvious gravitational pull toward Preston's magnetic presence across the patio. Within minutes of arriving, she'd gravitated toward him like a moth to flame, engaging in the kind of animated conversation and intimate body language that made every other person at the party pretend not to notice what was clearly happening right in front of everyone. I watched from across the pool area as their interaction grew progressively more physical and inappropriate, starting with casual touches on his arm during conversation and escalating to prolonged hand-holding and whispered exchanges that excluded everyone else around them. The other guests began shooting uncomfortable glances in my direction, clearly recognizing the awkward situation developing but unsure whether to intervene or simply pretend they hadn't witnessed my girlfriend openly flirting with another man at a social gathering where we'd arrived together. I tried to maintain my composure and continue normal conversations about Tyler's renovation process and the latest Phoenix Suns season, but my attention kept drifting to the increasingly intimate display happening 20 feet away as Celeste laughed too loudly at Preston's jokes and allowed his hands to roam freely across her shoulders and lower back. The breaking point arrived when I returned from the kitchen with fresh drinks for both of us, only to discover Celeste sitting provocatively across Preston's lap on one of Tyler's outdoor lounge chairs, his hands boldly exploring her thighs while they whispered intimately and gazed into each other's eyes as if they were completely alone rather than surrounded by 29 other people who were desperately trying to pretend this wasn't happening. The casual cruelty of the scene hit me like a physical blow as I realized she'd orchestrated this entire evening specifically to publicly humiliate me while positioning herself with Preston in the most obvious way possible. I stood frozen for several seconds, drinks still in my hands, watching the woman I'd loved and supported for over 2 years essentially groping another man at a party we'd attended together, while our mutual friends shifted uncomfortably and avoided making eye contact with me. When I finally found my voice and approached their little intimate bubble, asking with remarkable calm what exactly was happening between them, Celeste didn't even have the decency to stand up or remove herself from Preston's lap before delivering her crushing response. She looked up at me with a mixture of defiance and satisfaction, clearly relishing the power dynamic she'd created, and announced loud enough for nearby conversations to pause that she could keep her options open because I was always so boring and predictable, while Preston understood that life should be lived fully without the artificial restrictions I imposed on authentic self-expression. The words hit harder than any physical slap could have as she continued her public dismantling of our relationship, explaining to everyone within earshot that our 2-year partnership had been holding her back from discovering her true adventurous nature and that monogamy was an antiquated concept she'd never truly agreed to follow despite never mentioning this philosophical objection during any of our previous conversations about commitment and future planning. She described me as emotionally stunted and afraid of real passion, someone who preferred safe predictability over the kind of intense connection she'd found with Preston, who wasn't afraid to push boundaries and explore the full spectrum of human experience without apologies or limitations. The verbal assault continued as she detailed how I'd suffocated her creative spirit with my conventional approach to relationships and my insistence on treating her like property rather than an independent person capable of making her own choices about connection and intimacy. Rather than creating the dramatic scene Celeste clearly expected or begging her to reconsider her choices in front of our entire social circle, I made the conscious decision to maintain whatever dignity I had left by simply nodding once, setting down the drinks I'd been holding, and walking calmly to retrieve my jacket from Tyler's coat closet without saying another word to anyone. The silence that followed my quiet exit felt heavier than any argument could have, and I could sense the collective discomfort of 30 people who just witnessed something they wished they could unsee, but I refused to give Celeste the satisfaction of seeing me break down or lose control in the way she'd obviously anticipated. I walked through Tyler's front door and into the warm desert night air, feeling strangely calm despite the emotional devastation of what had just transpired, as if some protective numbness had settled over me to prevent complete psychological collapse. The drive home through Phoenix's quiet residential streets gave me time to process what had actually happened, and by the time I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, my phone was already exploding with increasingly hostile messages from Celeste that revealed far more about her character than anything she'd said at the party. The first text accused me of being immature and running away like a child instead of staying to work through our relationship problems like an adult, which struck me as particularly ironic given that she'd been sitting on another man's lap while delivering this criticism of my emotional maturity. The messages escalated quickly from there, with her claiming that my departure proved I'd never really cared about her or our relationship, that I was using this incident as an excuse to abandon her when she needed support navigating her feelings for Preston, and that real love would have involved fighting for what we had instead of giving up at the first sign of complications. The twisted logic of these accusations was breathtaking in its complete disconnect from reality, as if she genuinely believed I should have competed for her attention while she publicly humiliated me, or that walking away from someone who'd chosen to explore other options represented some kind of failure on my part rather than a reasonable response to betrayal. Her texts grew more desperate and manipulative as the evening wore on, alternating between angry accusations about my selfishness and tearful pleas for understanding about the confusion she was experiencing regarding her feelings for both Preston and me, as though this was some natural disaster that had befallen her rather than a series of deliberate choices she'd made over several months. She claimed that Preston had been pursuing her relentlessly and that she'd been trying to resist his advances out of loyalty to our relationship, but that my boring predictability had made it impossible for her to feel genuinely excited about our future together, so she'd been torn between security and passion until tonight's events forced her to confront her true desires. The gaslighting continued with messages suggesting that I was being dramatic and cruel by ignoring her attempts at explanation, that couples were supposed to communicate through difficulties rather than shutting down completely, and that my silence was actually a form of emotional abuse designed to punish her for being honest about her needs and attractions. By midnight, the tone shifted again to angry entitlement as she accused me of being possessive and controlling, exactly like Marcus had been, using guilt and manipulation to keep her trapped in a relationship that no longer served her growth and authentic self-expression. This comparison to her abusive ex-boyfriend was particularly devastating because it represented everything I'd tried not to become during our relationship, but apparently my expectation of basic fidelity and respect was just another form of oppressive control that prevented her from living authentically. I read each message as it arrived, feeling a strange mixture of heartbreak and relief as the woman I'd loved revealed herself to be someone completely different from the person I thought I'd been building a future with, someone whose capacity for self-deception and blame-shifting was truly impressive in its scope and creativity. Around 1 a.m, I made the decision to block her number entirely, cutting off the stream of accusations and justifications that had been flooding my phone for hours, because I realized that no explanation she could offer would change what I'd witnessed or restore my ability to trust her moving forward. The sudden silence felt like stepping into a soundproof room after hours of chaotic noise, and for the first time since leaving Tyler's party, I could actually think clearly about what I wanted to do next rather than simply reacting to her emotional manipulation tactics. I sat in my darkened living room for a long time that night, not crying or drinking or calling friends for support, but simply processing the reality that someone I'd invested 2 years of my life in supporting and loving had been systematically preparing to replace me while accepting my emotional and financial support right up until the moment she found a better option. The betrayal felt almost academic in its completeness, like reading about someone else's relationship disaster rather than experiencing my own, probably because some part of my brain was protecting me from the full emotional impact until I was strong enough to handle the grief that would inevitably follow this numbness. By morning, I'd reached a clarity that surprised me with its firmness and finality, understanding that there would be no reconciliation or second chances because someone who could orchestrate that kind of public humiliation while justifying it as personal growth wasn't someone I could ever trust again, regardless of whatever explanations or apologies might follow in the coming days. The desperate night siege that followed our confrontation at Tyler's party revealed depths of manipulation and entitlement I never could have imagined from someone I'd loved and supported for over 2 years. At exactly 3:17 a.m., thunderous pounding erupted at my front door, accompanied by Celeste's increasingly frantic voice demanding entry and explanation with the kind of desperate urgency typically reserved for actual emergencies rather than relationship drama of her own creation. Her speech was noticeably slurred from what must have been hours of continued partying after I'd left Tyler's gathering, and she alternated between tearful apologies that blamed me for misunderstanding her intentions and angry accusations that characterized my departure as dramatic and cruel punishment for her honest exploration of feelings she couldn't control. The apologies followed a predictable script of manipulation, claiming that Preston was just harmless fun and that I was overreacting to natural chemistry between friends, while conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd witnessed her sitting provocatively on his lap while his hands roamed freely across her body in front of 30 people who knew we were supposedly in a committed relationship. She insisted through my locked door that she'd been drinking and wasn't thinking clearly, that the physical intimacy with Preston had been spontaneous and meaningless rather than the culmination of months of emotional preparation and deliberate boundary crossing that I'd been too naive to recognize at the time. The angry accusations revealed far more about her true character than any apology could have, as she berated me for being immature and cruel by ignoring her attempts at communication, suggesting that real men would have stayed to fight for their relationships instead of running away like children who couldn't handle adult conversations about evolving feelings and changing dynamics. According to her twisted logic, my refusal to engage with her demands for immediate reconciliation proved that I'd never really cared about our relationship or her emotional well-being, that I was using this incident as a convenient excuse to abandon her when she needed support navigating the confusion created by Preston's pursuit and her own conflicted desires. She claimed that mature couples worked through difficulties together rather than shutting down communication and retreating into silence, as though her public humiliation of me represented some minor relationship speed bump rather than a fundamental betrayal of trust and respect that revealed her complete disregard for my feelings and dignity. The desperation in her voice grew more pronounced as hours passed, and I remained motionless in my darkened bedroom, fighting every instinct to comfort her as her cries echoed through the apartment complex hallways and undoubtedly woke my neighbors who would spend the following weeks giving me sympathetic looks whenever we passed in the parking lot. I could hear her alternating between sobbing pleas for forgiveness and angry demands that I open the door like a real man instead of hiding behind locked barriers like a coward, her voice carrying the kind of raw desperation that comes from realizing that actions have genuine consequences that can't be manipulated or rationalized away. She tried every emotional manipulation tactic in her arsenal, claiming that she was scared and alone and needed me to comfort her through the confusion Preston had created, that I was being deliberately cruel by forcing her to face the consequences of choices she characterized as mistakes rather than deliberate decisions made over several months of systematic preparation. The performance continued until sunrise, with her cycling through tears, anger, bargaining, and threats in a desperate attempt to find the emotional key that would unlock my door and restore her access to the stability and support I'd been providing while she explored more exciting options with my replacement. By morning, she'd finally vanished, leaving only a crumpled handwritten note wedged under my door that read, "We can fix this if you'll just talk to me. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable," which I immediately discarded without reading it completely because I recognized the same manipulative language that had characterized her text messages from the previous evening. The following day, I made the practical decision to change my locks and begin the process of removing all traces of her presence from my apartment, boxing up her scattered belongings that had accumulated over months of gradually increasing cohabitation and preparing them for return without any accompanying conversation or negotiation about our relationship status. The task of collecting her things revealed just how thoroughly she'd integrated herself into my living space and daily routines, from the expensive shampoo in my shower that I'd been purchasing without question to the designer clothes hanging in my closet that she'd claimed were temporary storage until her own closet space improved. I found myself recognizing items I'd purchased for her during shopping trips where she'd admired things we couldn't afford on her irregular income, Gifts I'd given freely because I wanted to see her happy but now understood were simply expected contributions to maintaining her lifestyle while she prepared to transition to someone who could provide even more financial support along with the excitement I apparently lacked. The jewelry I'd bought for various occasions, the expensive art supplies she'd requested for her creative projects that never seemed to materialize into actual income, the books about personal growth and authentic living that had obviously been influencing her philosophy about relationship structures and personal freedom. All of it went into boxes without sentiment or regret because these objects now represented the systematic exploitation of my generosity rather than shared memories or genuine appreciation. During the following days, I embraced strategic silence as my primary response to her continued attempts at contact through various channels, using the quiet space to process the emotional whiplash and begin reconnecting with aspects of my life I'd neglected during our relationship. I reached out to friends I'd distanced myself from because Celeste found them boring or incompatible with her social circle, rediscovering conversations and activities that didn't revolve around managing her moods or accommodating her unpredictable schedule of networking events and creative pursuits. I enrolled in the photography course I'd been postponing because our weekend plans always seemed to conflict with the class schedule, finally having the mental energy and free time to pursue interests that were genuinely mine rather than activities chosen to make her happy or support her constantly evolving career aspirations. The silence also allowed me to recognize how much emotional labor I'd been performing to maintain our relationship, constantly analyzing her moods and adjusting my behavior to prevent conflicts or disappointment, walking on eggshells around topics that might trigger her defensiveness about Preston or her criticism about my lack of spontaneity and adventure. Through our network of mutual friends, I began learning details about Celeste's spectacular downfall that unfolded with the kind of poetic justice that almost seemed too perfectly orchestrated to be real. Her grand strategy of keeping multiple options open while maintaining financial security through my support had backfired in ways that revealed both Preston's true character and her complete inability to accurately assess people's motivations beyond their surface appeal. According to Tyler and several other friends who'd witnessed the aftermath of that disastrous party, Celeste had moved in with Preston within days of our confrontation, apparently convinced that their passionate connection represented the authentic love and adventure she'd been missing during our stable but boring relationship. The transition happened with breathtaking speed that suggested she'd been planning this move for weeks or possibly months, using our relationship as a safety net while she prepared to leap into what she believed would be a more exciting and fulfilling partnership with someone who understood her need for freedom and spontaneous living. Preston's true character emerged almost immediately once Celeste became his responsibility rather than just an exciting diversion from his actual commitments and obligations. The charming adventurer who'd seemed so confident and financially successful at networking events turned out to be financially irresponsible in ways that made my middle-class stability look like incredible wealth and security. His extreme sports lifestyle and constant travel weren't funded by cryptocurrency success as he'd claimed, but by credit card debt and questionable income sources that became apparent once Celeste was living with him and witnessing his daily reality rather than just the carefully curated social media presence he'd used to seduce her away from me. The expensive restaurants and spontaneous weekend trips that had made me look boring and predictable were financed through increasingly desperate financial juggling that included borrowing money from friends, maxing out credit cards, and eventually asking Celeste to contribute funds she didn't actually possess since her income had always been sporadic at best. Preston proved to be emotionally volatile in ways that made Marcus's controlling behavior look subtle and sophisticated, prone to explosive outbursts whenever Celeste questioned his mysterious income sources or suggested they needed to be more practical about their spending habits. The freedom and adventure she'd craved turned into walking on eggshells around someone whose mood swings were unpredictable and whose anger could be triggered by anything from a disappointing investment outcome to her innocent questions about their financial situation. His attitude toward women became apparent once the initial excitement wore off and he realized that Celeste expected the same level of attention and financial support I'd been providing, except now combined with the constant drama and adventure that had initially attracted her to him. The networking events and creative collaborations that had supposedly justified her late nights turned out to be covers for Preston's involvement with multiple women from his CrossFit gym and investment circles. Relationships he maintained simultaneously without any pretense of the monogamy Celeste had rejected as outdated when it applied to our relationship but apparently still expected to receive once she'd committed to him. Within 2 months of their passionate beginning, Preston had abandoned her completely, moving on to his next conquest and leaving Celeste financially devastated, professionally reputation damaged, and forced to crash on various friends' couches while our entire social circle witnessed her dramatic fall from the confident woman who'd publicly humiliated me to someone desperately seeking temporary housing and emotional support from people who'd watched her burn bridges with calculated cruelty. The impulsive decision to quit her graphic design job to explore creative freedom with Preston proved catastrophic when his promised connections and collaborative projects turned out to be fantasy rather than reality, leaving her without income, references, or professional credibility in an industry where reputation and reliability matter more than artistic vision or creative authenticity. Her former colleagues at the design studio had apparently grown tired of her erratic behavior and constant drama about relationship complications, making it impossible for her to return to her previous position even if she'd been willing to swallow her pride and ask for forgiveness from supervisors she'd dismissed as lacking vision and creativity. The friends who'd initially supported her decision to leave me for someone more exciting grew weary of providing emotional support and temporary housing for someone whose problems were entirely self-created and who showed no signs of taking responsibility for the choices that had led to her current situation. Meanwhile, my life had transformed in ways that surprised me with their positive impact on my overall happiness and sense of purpose, proving that losing Celeste had actually freed me to become a better version of myself rather than the diminished person she'd made me feel like during our final months together. I'd earned a well-deserved promotion at my architectural firm, recognition for the sustainable building designs I'd been developing during the period when Celeste was criticizing my work as conventional and unimaginative, and my colleagues had noticed the renewed energy and focus I brought to projects once I wasn't spending mental energy managing relationship drama and accommodation demands. The photography course I'd enrolled in led to weekend trips exploring Arizona's incredible landscape, adventures that felt genuinely fulfilling rather than desperate attempts to prove I could be spontaneous and exciting enough to deserve love and attention from someone who valued surface excitement over deeper compatibility. I'd begun casually dating again without rushing into anything serious, meeting women who appreciated stability and thoughtfulness rather than viewing these qualities as character flaws that needed to be overcome through constant challenges and dramatic incidents designed to prove passion and commitment. The contrast between my growing contentment and Celeste's increasingly desperate situation created a satisfying sense of vindication that felt earned rather than petty, confirmation that the foundation I'd tried to build with her had been solid and valuable despite her rejection of everything it represented. The final confrontation that brought our story full circle occurred 4 months later at our mutual friend's engagement celebration at a trendy downtown Phoenix rooftop bar, where I arrived confidently with Rebecca, my new girlfriend who embodied everything I'd learned to value about genuine partnership and mutual respect. Rebecca was a fellow architect I'd met through the photography group, someone who shared my appreciation for thoughtful planning and sustainable design while also bringing her own adventurous spirit that felt authentic rather than performative, the kind of woman who suggested hiking trips because she genuinely loved nature rather than because she needed to prove her spontaneity to an audience. The engagement party was exactly the kind of sophisticated gathering where Celeste had always thrived, complete with craft cocktails and panoramic city views that provided the perfect backdrop for the kind of social media presence she'd cultivated throughout our relationship, so I wasn't entirely surprised when she appeared unexpectedly despite not being on the original guest list. She looked disheveled in a way that expensive clothes and professional makeup couldn't quite disguise, carrying herself with the desperate energy of someone who was trying too hard to project confidence while obviously struggling with circumstances beyond her control, and I recognized immediately that this encounter was not the coincidence she would undoubtedly claim it to be. Celeste spotted me within minutes of her arrival and began making her way across the crowded rooftop with obvious purpose, shooting hostile glances at Rebecca while clearly preparing for the kind of dramatic confrontation that had always been her preferred method of handling situations that didn't develop according to her expectations and desires. I watched her approach with the calm detachment that comes from having moved completely beyond someone's ability to manipulate your emotions, feeling neither anger nor anxiety but simply curious about what kind of performance she was planning to deliver in this public setting where she'd once held such social power and influence. When she finally cornered me near the bar area while Rebecca was talking with other guests about sustainable architecture trends, Celeste launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about recognizing me as the one after Preston's abuse had taught her to appreciate genuine love and commitment over superficial excitement and adventure. She claimed that her experience with Preston had been a necessary learning journey that helped her understand the difference between authentic connection and manipulative seduction, that she was ready to embrace monogamy and rebuild our real connection based on the foundation of trust and respect we'd supposedly shared before Preston's interference disrupted her judgment and emotional clarity. The speech felt rehearsed and desperate, full of therapeutic language about personal growth and self-discovery that couldn't disguise the fundamental fact that she was only interested in reconciliation because her preferred option had abandoned her and she needed someone to provide the stability and support she'd rejected when it came without sufficient excitement attached. She talked about being ready for the kind of mature relationship I'd always wanted to build with her, claiming that Preston's emotional volatility and financial irresponsibility had taught her to value my predictable reliability and steady character, qualities she now recognized as evidence of genuine love rather than boring limitations on her personal freedom and authentic self-expression. But everything about her approach revealed that she still viewed our potential reconciliation as a negotiation where she held cards worth playing rather than understanding that some betrayals permanently alter the fundamental dynamic between two people regardless of whatever lessons might be learned through subsequent experiences. I responded with the calm finality that had been building throughout these months of personal growth and emotional recovery, telling her that her betrayal had taught me self-respect and that I'd built something genuinely peaceful and fulfilling with someone who appreciated the qualities she'd found suffocating rather than viewing them as character flaws that needed to be overcome through drama and excitement. I explained that her current problems were entirely her own responsibility to solve, that the foundation she'd rejected couldn't be rebuilt simply because she'd discovered that alternatives were less satisfying than she'd anticipated, and that genuine personal growth would involve accepting the consequences of choices rather than expecting forgiveness from people she'd systematically devalued and replaced. When she began the predictable breakdown that had always been her final manipulation tactic when other approaches failed to achieve the desired outcome, I turned back to Rebecca and our friends without being moved by tears that felt calculated rather than genuine, finally free from the emotional prison I'd built around our toxic dynamic. The sight of Celeste crying alone on a rooftop where she'd once commanded attention felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with her calling me her foundation while planning her escape to someone more exciting, except now I was the one who'd moved on to something genuinely better while she remained trapped in the consequences of choices that had seemed so empowering when she made them. Rebecca handled the entire situation with the kind of mature grace that highlighted the difference between someone who was secure in herself and someone who needed constant drama and validation to feel alive, never once questioning my past or demanding explanations about why my ex-girlfriend was making scenes at social gatherings we attended together. As we left the party that evening, I realized that I felt genuinely grateful to Celeste for teaching me what I didn't want in a relationship and showing me the difference between someone who saw me as a resource to exploit and someone who valued me as a partner worth building something lasting with, even though that gratitude would never translate into forgiveness or reconciliation.